All right, and now for our featured speaker, Mandy Butler will be talking to us about Proposition 1, which will be showing up on the primary ballot. Mandy is the chair of the Pros and Cons Committee for the League of Women Voters of North County, San Diego. In this role, she works with a team to develop and present information about the state propositions and local measures that appear on our ballots. Mandy lives in Del Mar and is a retired professor of biology at UCSD and biotech science. Thank you, Mandy.
Thanks. I just have some notes I want to make sure that I cover. So I'll have a presentation as well. Here. Okay, so as your president said, my name is Mandy Butler. I am chair of the Pros and Cons Committee. I started doing this just 2 years ago after I retired. I am not a legal analyst. This has just been something that's really interested me, and I've tried to educate myself. We have a team that works together to discuss and educate ourselves on the different ballot issues and measures. Next slide. So just to remind you, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan group. We do never support a specific candidate or party. Our mission is really to educate the public about voter issues and to encourage voter participation. Having said that, the League does take a stand on certain issues, and you'll see that later on in my talk, but we don't support specific candidates or parties. Okay, next slide. We had a talk the other day by the Register of Voters here in San Diego, and she asked that we just remind everyone that's planning to vote in person not to wait to the last day. The voting sites, all the voting centers will be open from the 2nd to the 5th. And a lot of people do like to vote in person, but they're asking people to please try and vote earlier rather than the last day. So that's just a plug from the League of the Register of Voters. Okay, next slide. So what I'm here today to talk about is the only proposition that's going to be on the March ballot. But before I do that, I want to talk about propositions in general. We know as California voters, every statewide election cycle, we see multiple propositions or measures on the ballot. And they can vary. They are often tax increases or bond issues or a change to a statute or a law. Statewide measures are usually indicated by a number. So they're Proposition 1, Proposition 26. Local measures are called measures, and they're just designated by a letter. Most measures, propositions require a simple majority of the voters who pass, so some local ones do have higher percentages that required. Now, if you remember from November 2022, there were 7 statewide propositions on the ballot. That was a relative low. This year, 10 have already qualified to be on the November ballot, and there are many more in the works collecting signatures. So it's probably going to be kind of a boom year for statewide propositions on the ballot. Next slide. Just to remind you too, how do propositions get on the ballot? How do they even appear on your ballot? So first of all, the state legislature can place constitutional amendments, bond issues, and changes to existing statutes on the ballot as a proposition. They have to do that for constitutional amendments and bond issues. So some propositions you'll see in Proposition 1 that will be on the March ballot is an example of this. It's a legislature proposition. But the other way propositions get on the ballot is by California voters proposing an initiative. And they can propose an initiative to amend the Constitution or a statute without the support of the legislature. Or they can initiate a referendum, which would veto a law that's already in existence. Now, how do they do that? It's a long, lengthy process. It costs a lot of money. But if you go back to November 2022, if you think about, remember some of the propositions that were on that ballot, we had Proposition 1, which was a legislature promoted, proposition. And that was to enshrine reproductive rights and abortion rights in the California Constitution. That was from the legislature. Most of the other propositions were citizen-initiated propositions. And if you remember, there were two gaming ones, and there was the ubiquitous dialysis one that we seem to see every election. Those were initiated by citizens. And what has to happen there is a group, for example, with the gaming ones, it was tribes and gaming companies went out and have to collect signatures from citizens, and then that initiative will get on the ballot. Somewhere, depending on the type of proposition, they have to collect between 500,000 to about 900,000 signatures. This costs a lot of money. So you really, these propositions, when you see them on the ballot, they have cost a lot to get it on the ballot. Okay, so this year, though, this March, so like I said, in November, there's probably going to be a lot of propositions on the ballot. But this March, there's only one. There were two others that were led by the legislature, but they moved them to November. But they kept this one for the March ballot. And this is, again, from the legislature. It's called the Behavioral Health Services Program and Bond Measure. And one of the things it does is it authorizes $6.4 billion in bonds to be raised to promote, to build mental health treatment facilities, some housing. It also does some other things that we'll talk about. Okay, next slide. So before I talk about what the proposition will do, I want to give a little background as to why this proposition was put into effect by the legislature. And I don't know, back in 2004, you may remember, there was something called the millionaire's tax. There was a proposition that would initiate what was called the millionaire's tax. And this proposition actually, it was Proposition 63. It established the Mental Health Services Act. And the act provided funding for county mental health programs. And what it was it a 1% income tax on income over $1 million. So that was initiated back in 2004. Now, of those funds, about $2 to $3.5 billion is raised a year from those funds. And 95% of the funds go to counties to provide mental health services for those with mental health issues, and also for substance abuse users with mental health issues. So the money is given directly to counties. The counties have a lot of flexibility in the kind of programs they can offer for these patients. A lot of them, I don't want to go into too much detail, but a lot of them are like crisis response teams, preventative programs, outpatient care. Okay? But if you go to the next slide, these funds cannot be used for housing. Okay, they're really for outpatient treatment, things like that. And we all know that there's a severe homelessness crisis in California. There was a study from University of California, San Francisco that came out, I think it was last year, and they approximated at least 170,000 homeless in California. They also estimate that at least, probably around 75,000 have severe mental health illness or substance abuse disorders. Another 10,000 of that homeless population, at least, are veterans. So, lots of studies have shown that people who experience homelessness have higher rates of mental health conditions and substance abuse than the general population. So we know that there's a severe housing crisis and homelessness crisis in the state. And next slide. What happened is the the legislature and the governor are trying to find solutions to this problem. So 2 bills were passed in the legislature last year, Senate Bill 326 and Assembly Bill 531. And their stated purpose with this was to lessen the housing crisis among those with mental health issues and substance abuse issues. And when they approved these bills, they also, in the bill, were provisions requiring both of the bills to appear jointly together as Prop 1. The Bill 531 is the bill approving the $6.4 million in bonds. The other bill, Bill 326, will change how the Mental Health Services Act funds are used. So these 2 bills were combined and they'll be on the ballot as Proposition 1. I should mention both of these bills were passed almost unanimously in the Senate and the House. So both Democrats and Republicans approved these bills. There were some Republican holdouts, but they really had a big majority of the representatives and the senators voted for these bills. So just try, let's go to the next slide. So what will this proposition do? I have not gotten into this in great detail, but the first thing is it will authorize $6.4 billion in bonds to fund construction of primarily facilities for mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment. There's also about $4.5 billion goes for this, for building facilities, treatment facilities. Another $2 billion will go for housing, and half of that specifically will go for housing for veterans. So about $4.4 billion for treatment facilities, the other $2 billion for housing. Now, the other thing this does, and this is that other bill, it changes how the revenue from the millionaire's tax, the 1%, will be spent. Now, right now, as I said, 95% of that money goes to counties, and they have a lot of flexibility in how to spend the money. One of the things the bill will change is that it will change it to 90% will go to counties, 10% will go to the state for statewide services. The other thing it does is it also mandates, it puts more restrictions on how the money is spent, or not restriction, it categorizes more specifically how the money has to be spent. And it says that 30% of that money, that 90% that the counties get, has to go to housing rather than these mental health services. So it's kind of saying, okay, you're not going to have complete flexibility on how to spend that money. You have to spend 30% on housing services. And there's some other things in there like employment services. So it kind of delineates more specifically how the money has to be spent. It also is renaming the act to the Behavioral Health Services Act because they're expanding the purview of the services to those with substance abuse without mental illness. Under the previous act, you had to have a mental illness to get the substance abuse services. Now they're going to open it up. Okay, I know that's kind of complicated. The bills together are something like 100 pages. So there's a lot more specifics in the bills. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what are the fiscal impacts? I should mention this, I'm going to show you some references at the end where this information has come from, but there's something called the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is a nonpartisan service where they analyze the bills and also analyze the fiscal impacts, and that's where this information comes from. So there wouldn't be any changes to the tax. The 1% tax on the income over $1 million, that will stay the same. They're not raising that tax. So that stays the same. So that source of funding, it will not change. But again, it changes how that money will be spent a little. Again, 30% has to go to housing and more will go to the state. So what the analysts say is that thus counties will have less money for existing mental health services. And they may need to use other county funds or state funds or federal funds to keep current service levels. So that's one impact. Next slide. The other thing, obviously, it's a bond issue. So the state, they estimate that the repayment costs will be $310 million annually for 30 years, and that will come out of the general fund. The general fund is what the state uses to pay for most public services, education, health, prisons, and so on. Now, they estimate that the state would build treatment facilities care for about 6,800 people. So again, that it's not close to the 170,000, whatever percent of that population is, has mental health issues. Also, they estimate that the bond will pay for about 4,000 housing units, with about a half of that set aside for veterans. Again, the number of housing units this will pay for is not going to solve the housing crisis. There are other things that are coming out of the general fund that are being used for housing issues too. So this is not going to be the major, solution to the housing crisis. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is who's supporting this and who's opposing this. And I should start off by saying, again, this was initiated by the legislature. Gavin Newsom signed off on it. And so the legislature and Gavin Newsom are obviously supporting this. There's a lot of other groups supporting it. For example, Blue Shield of California, firefighters, there's a lot of cities, the California Chamber of Commerce, and a lot, there's a lot more groups supporting this. For example, the LA Sheriff's Office came out and said they're supporting it because they were saying that right now, basically almost half of their people in their prisons have mental health issues, and the prisons are being used for, people who really need mental health treatment. So a lot of these sheriff offices, things are coming out in favor of it. And again, the people who are supporting it say, it's going to pay for needed housing for people who are chronically unhoused, and it will pay for needed construction and rehabilitation of psychiatric and other facilities for the treatment of people with mental health illness and substance use disorders. Gavin Newsom has a kind of coalition called Treatment.Tense that is promoting this proposition. Again, with every proposition, there's groups that are supporting it, that are raising money to help advertising it at. And so that Gavin Newsom has this group, Treatment.Tense, that's raising money to kind of promote this proposition. Next slide. So who's opposing it? And here's why I have to right away make a caveat. You can see that the League of Women Voters of California is opposing this issue. That is coming from our advocacy branch. I am not part of that. I'm just part of the education branch. So I am not, I'm just telling you that that's one of the groups opposing it. The Davis Vanguard is opposing it. A lot of, some of the disability and mental health groups in the state are opposing it. And the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, they'll oppose any bond issue basically. So yeah, so they're opposing it. So why are these groups opposing it? So again, some of it's based on the fact that it's a bond issue. Like I said, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Group are opposing it on that grounds. But some of these other groups, especially some of the disability and mental health groups, are opposing it because, and this relates back, before I go into why they're opposing it, does everybody know about the CARES Court Act? How the state has made it so that people with mental health issues, there's going to be this court, and people can be, if they don't comply with the program, be put under conservatorship. And let's say, people are saying it's involuntary commitment to a facility. So a lot of people are against that. And a lot of these groups that are against this proposition are against it because, and I need to go into this a little, when the bill first was promoted, the language in the bill said the money can only be used for voluntary facilities. facilities where people entered voluntarily. And for 5 months, it was promoted that way. But right before the bill was passed, they took out that language. So the money now can be used for places where there's involuntary commitment. So that's why a lot of these other groups are now opposing it. And that's one of the reasons I think the League of Women Voters of California is opposing it. So, and the other reason is some of the smaller groups that run services for counties are saying, well, there's going to be less money for us. You know, if 30% of our funding has to go for housing now, we're going to have less money to provide the services that we now provide. Yeah.
I wanted to clarify. You mean it's either voluntary or involuntary?
No, both. Both. But originally the bill said just funding for voluntary facilities that people entered voluntarily. They took out that language. So now it can be used for facilities where people are put under conservatorship and basically admitted involuntarily. So that's why some of these groups are against. So anyway, yeah. Yes. So back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of those were closed. They were shut down. Well, you know, people, I'm not taking a stand on that, okay? But the CARES court, if somebody doesn't comply with the program, they can be put under conservatorship. So, okay. So, okay, next slide. Thanks. Oh, one thing I usually also talk about money. So with any of these propositions, a lot of money is spent advertising. So if you remember the gaming propositions, tens of millions of dollars spent, you know, promoting those or opposing those. Same things will happen with this. $8 million has already been raised by Newsom's treatment not tense group I think you all know, you'll get a postcard in the mail that says vote for Proposition 1 or oppose, well, that costs money. And so both of these groups, the opponents and the supporters, will start raising money to advertise their stand. Newsom's group, the treatment not tense, they have already raised $8 billion. According to the Secretary of State website, I don't see any money raised by the opposing groups yet. We're still a month out from the election at least, so that may change. So most of the sources that we use when we do, these are some of the most useful sources we find in doing research on propositions. They're really pretty good sources. Again, League of Women Voters, I put up there, but they have decided to oppose it. So that is not a neutral group right now. Next slide. And just to put in a plug, if anybody's interested in joining the North County League of Women Voters, we'd love to have you. We do all sorts of work. We do this pros and cons, but we do lots of other education. We do voter registration and so on. So thank you very much. That's hopefully that sheds some light. And again, I tried to keep it short without going into too many gory details.
Thank you. That was really good. I like that. Great concept. I appreciate it. Thank you. All right. Oh, yes. Are there any questions